Ryszardzie. Tak. Raz, dwa, trzy. Marku, możemy zaczynać, tak? Dziękuję bardzo. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mateusz Fałkowski. I'm Deputy Director of the Pilecki Institute. And tonight's debate, shifting concepts, shifting perceptions, the East and the West in 2022, an outdated dichotomy with question mark, takes place as a part of the Exercising Modernity program. And at the Pilecki Institute, we try to research, to digitize, and tell Polish history, but it's impossible to tell Polish history without the history of the entire wider region. Nor is it possible to tell a story, to tell this history of Polish history by concentrating only on events. You have to take into account culture and structure, so the history of concepts and also the travels of these concepts. Modernity can be such a useful lens through which we can look at the history and the present from different angles and with the tools of different scholarly disciplines. Exercising Modernity has been an important part of our program for the past 4 years and is also about creating a certain cognitive dissonance. That the dissonance that modernity comes from different directions and travels along various paths. That this modernity has its bright but also its dark sides. What is East and what is West is a very old discussion. Russia's war against Ukraine and our reactions, so the reactions of societies of the European Union, provide a new context here. And we have wonderful guests tonight, a literary scholar, a security expert, and an experienced journalist, and from Poland and from Germany. And I hand over the mic to Patryk Szostak, who will be the moderator of this discussion. So please take the floor.
Good evening to all of you. Thank you for coming at this time in the evening. Outdated dichotomies, outdated concepts. So during one of our previous discussions, I started our discussion by saying, ladies and gentlemen, and was then advised that this apparently is also an outdated notion. So I suggest I use the language game of dear audience when speaking to you, especially after the discussion, since a Q&A round is planned. And to you, my dear panelists, I will simply say, dear panelists. This is an event which takes part, or which is part of Exercising Modernity, a special devoted program of which numerous editions have already taken place, which was devoted to the history of modernity in Central and Eastern Europe. But not only there. In previous editions, participants would go to cities all over in Europe, but in Gdynia, to Weimar, to Tel Aviv, to find a common heritage which has not as of yet been acknowledged in a fashion which it deserves to. And this year we have all been touched and moved by the events which took place in February 2022. That's why it's not only exercising modernity, it's exercising Eastern modernity. And we've already had many seminars, workshops, examining what modernity meant in various cities and countries, in Minsk, in Lviv, in Poland. What are the architectural manifestations of this common set of ideas? But we thought that since the East and West have such tremendous weight in this year, it would be a worthwhile enterprise to re-examine what we actually mean when we say East, West, Eastern Europe, Western Europe. And that's why we've decided to invite a set of panelists with, as Mateusz mentioned, very various backgrounds. I start with my furthest right, which is a purely physical description. Professor Przemysław Czapliński, professor, historian of Polish and European literature, essayist, translator, literary critic, co-founder of the Department of Anthropology of Literature at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland. He's the author of numerous widely discussed, sometimes controversial books, such as Resztki Nowoczesności, The Remnants of Modernity. And he's also written a book which you could translate, its title you could translate its title as either The Shift of the Map or The Moved Map. And this is a book where Professor Czapliński has extensively analyzed the notions of west, east, north, and south, not only as geographical facts, but as certain imagined geographies, a term borrowed from Edward Said. And we are happy to have him as our guest. To my not so further right, but still further right, is Justyna Gotkowska. She's the coordinator of the project Security and Defense in Northern Europe at the Center of Eastern Studies, the famous Ośrodek Studiów Wschodnich. She graduated from University of Warsaw and RWTH Aachen University. She has been working at the Center for Eastern Studies since 2008. She has led and cooperated within various projects. She's also quite active on Twitter and is also famous for certain clashes, among them with Mr. Johannes Warwig, who might be well known to some of you tonight. And to my closest right, we can, this depends on whether we think of geography in terms of physical limits or narratives. Dr. Richard Herzinger. He lives and works as a journalist in Berlin. As an author, editor, and political correspondent, he worked for a long list of the most prominent and important German newspapers, among them Die Zeit, Tagesspiegel, and most recently for almost 15 years for Die Welt and Welt am Sonntag. He's also written numerous books, among them Endzeitpropheten oder Die Offensive der Anti-Westler, where he has, together with Hannes Stein, examined early forms of anti-West resentment. Right now, he's leading a site, Hold These Truths, where you can read his regular analysis and commentaries. But I would now like to move back and start from the beginning, so to speak. Professor Czapliński. In one of the interviews which I've ran with you, your diagnosis of West, East, North, and South and their functions in the political discourse, you've diagnosed the following way. Apparently, the first shift of the map took place in the 80s. A more general redirection of the Polish imagined geographies took root later on. What was the direction of these shifts? And you are sometimes you are being referred to as a detective of literature because you read many different authors and genres. So when we think of the East and the West in Poland today, is it possible to make a general diagnosis what we mean by this?
For your invitation. The question is heavy, gross, and of course difficult. The title of our discussion is An Outdated Dichotomy, ? It seems to me that dichotomies, especially in modernity, are evergreen. So they are gaining their second and third life. They are rebirthing constantly, but they are always mischievous, misleading, dangerous. Why? Because dichotomy divides a world, any world, the world, our, into two, giving us an appearance of precision categorization of the world, which is mischievous, misleading. And the division East-West is one of these evergreen dichotomy, gaining new life after February 2022. It is almost impossible to define East-West relation, East-West dichotomy, without defining your own position. So it should be always the the starting point. From what place, standpoint, point of view, you are defining these differences, East and West. Why? Because this dichotomy in the history of Europe was always moving and movable. Ancient Greeks perceived barbarians differently when they had war between Greece and Persians. And after that, barbarians came to Greece from the north, that is from Rome. And for ancient Romanians, barbarians were inhabiting the north of Europe. And then the division East-West was leading in the modern Europe. So what is happening now? It seems to us that East is Russia and West is Europe. But during this conflict, this war, spatial operation, according to Putin's words, during this war, there are still conflicts between Central Europe states, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and the Western states of the European Union. So there is no one West and there is no one East. That is the first conclusion. Second, it should be remembered during the whole discussion the difference between the East defined when we are pointing at the government, Russia government, Putin, the military forces, and the society. Because when we omit this difference between government, politicians, authorities, and the society, we are making a false unity of the East, whereas it seems to me that there are lots of protests during the war inside Russian society against the war, against the Putin's politics. So there are differences in the East and in the West. Third point. Maybe it could be useful right now to think of a future, nearest future history that is the history right after the war. And that is why I am here, probably. Because I'm a historian of literature. So I read books, lots of books. And the literature is a sort of permanent experiment on history, geography, social imaginary, social plots, narratives. So I'm always trying to convince people to imagine the nearest future, starting with what if? What if the war ends? What after? Would we start to communicate with Russians? What kind of Russia would be the best for the continent, the whole Europe, the societies, and the democracy? What if? Moreover, when we are trying to characterize the future Russia, we can see autocracy and anti-democracy movements inside Europe, inside Germany, Poland, France. Nowadays, what is the probable future? Which version of it is most probable? This connected with democracy or with autocracy? The difference between East and West will be maintained based on the difference between democracy and autocracy, or quite differently. Namely, the more autocracy, for instance, in France, for instance, in Germany, will shorten the distance or the gap between the West and the East. Yes? So I don't have solutions, strict answers to your questions, but more questions.
Very much. And Justyna Gotkowska, your field of expertise is usually being referred to as defense and security studies. But you've also used the notion of a certain culture of security and culture of defense. And my question would be, referring to what just Professor Czaplinski said, when we think of the East and the West in geopolitical or international politics term, starting from the 90s, do you also see such a huge set of ambivalences and reproducing dichotomies which by definition remain imprecise? Or are we there standing on much more concrete ground?
Thank you for this question. Thank you for inviting me. Indeed, I deal with security and defense and rarely take part in such in broader, partly philosophical discussions about the East and the West. But from my perspective, security and defense point of view, the West is quite clearly defined, especially in the situation we are right now in. The West is defined as countries rooted in the Western civilization, in the tradition of ancient Greco-Roman culture, Christianity, Enlightenment. Geographically, it encompasses Europe, but not only. Countries beyond that, with strong links, historic, cultural, political, to Europe. This is primarily the US, but it's also Canada, Australia. In political terms, it implies obeying to principles of democracy, political pluralism, rule of law, observing human rights, individualism. And for me, it's clear that the political representation of the West is the EU and NATO. And the East has been shrinking since the collapse of, or in the 20th century, and I think that what we are facing right now is the East being limited to Russia with its ambitions of creating or recreating spheres of influence in terms of Ruski Mir, Russia being an authoritarian power, and defining itself as a civilization of its own, as an anti-Western civilization. I think the lines in security and defense are very clear, and no one has much doubt about that right now. And on the one hand, I agree with Professor Czaplinski that there have been, or there are certain divisions among the countries belonging to the West, among the member states of the EU and NATO, on how to handle the situation we are right now in, on the sanctions vis-à-vis Russia, on the policy vis-à-vis Russia, on the way how we support Ukraine. But overall, the West has shown its strength. The West has shown a unity that allowed to adopt several sanction packages, and the effects of these sanctions we are seeing right now, and their impact on Russia. And the West has been able to support Ukraine financially, politically, and militarily. Of course, we have different actors within the West. Those who are ready to support Ukraine to a large extent, with the US, UK, and the countries on the eastern flank, with Western European partners being more reluctant. But overall, this support is working, even if we need to, from our side, to exert pressure on our biggest partners and allies in the Western Europe. And going back in history and coming to the end of the Cold War, and talking about Poland and Poland's perceptions of the West, I think it has been a very clear goal of all Polish government, and a very clear goal of the Polish political elites to rejoin the West, because I think that Poland has perceived itself for centuries as a part of the Western civilization, and the Cold War period and the Soviet occupation and the communist times were seen only as an aberration of the Polish history. And therefore, the Polish strive to join NATO, to join the EU, in order not to remain in a gray zone between the West and the East, understood as Russia, because such gray zones would only be exploited by our bigger neighbor, to regain control, political, economic, and military over our region. And right now, in the same situation, Ukraine is entering, and we cannot allow to have these gray zones between us and Russia again, because this means conflict, instability, and war in the midterm and long-term future. And therefore, our clear goal is to support Ukraine to join the EU, which is formally accepted, at least on a political level, and it should be our clear goal for Ukraine to also join NATO in order to end the Russian neo-imperial dreams for Eastern Europe. And I think that only through such steps we will ensure in a mid and long-term peace in our part of the world.
Thank you very much. It's, I think, interesting to see that with the East and West gaining momentum as notions in 2022, they have such a strong role in our daily discourse and can be applied so differently depending on the field. Dr. Richard Herzinger, we are sitting right now in Berlin across the Brandenburger Gate. I think what we could do now is take a step back analytically and back the camera up, so to speak, with regards to German relationships with the East/Russia question mark. You've written a long piece, which you have published on your web page. The title was Deutsche Russland-Sehnsucht. And you quote a number of very, very well-known and prominent German thinkers, poets, philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche, Rainer Maria Rilke, Thomas Mann. They have very different perspectives, but they share a certain affinity towards Russia, it seems. And even your title, Sucht is an addiction. Sehnsucht stems from a word from the 18th century, Sehnsucht, which was defined as an overarching sickness. And you write that the German relationship traditionally is highly antagonistic. It's a mixture of fear, fascination, respect. So my first question to you would be, what is the East from a German perspective? Is it the same as Russia? And since you're using so many emotional terms, maybe a bit of a provocative question, is this a subject matter up for debate as good as it is for a historian, as it is for a psychoanalyst?
Well, first of all, since I agree with mostly everything that was said before, I just would to add or to modify that the term West is not misleading only when it is not defined as a geographical or cultural or whatever concept, but as an idea, as an historical project, as the historian Heinrich August Winkler named it. And it is not bound to a certain geography or to a certain cultural heritage or determination or whatever. I'm very skeptical or even hostile to this cultural relativism that says, well, this is modern democracy, whatever, has grown out of the ground of the Western culture, and it is, you cannot transfer it to any other cultural, let's say China or even Eastern Europe, you know, and not Russia, because, and that's why we must not teach Russia our norms and values, because they are different. No, that's obviously not true. I mean, we have democracies in Asia, Japan, South Korea, even if they maybe not be exactly the same as ours, but the same principles, and especially Taiwan, which even shows us today what creative possibilities of participative democracy are possible. So having said this, of course, this culturalist idea was very much, since the days of the Romantic in Germany, decisive for defining German nationality, for German nationalism. And German nationalism defined itself, although Germany obviously is totally determined or influenced by Western culture, civilization, German nationalism defined itself in contrast to against the West, which meant especially France and Britain. And from this idea, or from this, it was a kind of minority, Minderwertigkeitskomplex, minority complex, yeah, turned into a idea of superiority of Germany, in contrast to the materialistic, rationalistic, soulless West, integrated all the influences of West and Eastern culture, and made a combination, or that is the highest cultural quality. That was the idea. And there, from this time on, there was this ambivalent relationship to Russia that you spoke of. You had on the, it was in fact a mix of fear and fascination. The fear, this huge country, yeah, Russia, this huge country, and with its uncivilized rawness, that was the picture, is a great danger. It's irrational. It is uncivilized. It is animalic. The Russian bear, you know. So this. But on the other hand, exactly these Eigenschaften, this, yeah, exactly this was also what the Germans were fascinated on, because it is an unadulterated, naive, natural. They are not. Russia is not yet misled by the materialistic civilization of the West. It's a young people. This was the term one German cultural philosopher, Arthur Möller van den Broek, used in the early 20th century, who later developed the concept of a conservative revolution. And it says Germany and Russia both are young peoples. That meant the West is the old, and Russia and Germany are the new, are the future, because they are so unadulterated, so they are not yet affected by the sickness of the West, by the civilizational sickness of the West. And on this basis, there was a very contradictory relationship. The German rearmament after the First World War was supported by, there was a secret alliance between Soviet Union and Germany to rearm Germany against the West, against the Versailles Treaty. Then, of course, there was the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939. So there was a great seduction always in the German extreme right to go with Russia against the West. It didn't work out because Hitler was a racist who thought Slavic people are Untermenschen, and he wouldn't go along with this. But this was always a possibility, that could have happened, and for 2 years, 1939 to 41, with devastating consequences, it really happened. So yeah, I stop here, but this ambivalent relationship toward Russia, this mythical, romanticizing picture of Russia in both ways of attraction, of fascination, and fear, still is virulent today in German relations towards Russia.
Thank you very much. And Professor Czaplinski, I would ask you now to also dig a bit deeper into popular Polish imaginations about Russia or the East. I think in your book, where you have analyzed many genres in books, you introduce the division into inspectors, collectors, and literary detectives. And you show that various Polish authors either show Russia as a country completely distinct from Poland and the West, and one which you could only criticize or make jokes of. Other authors seek ambivalences and try to show a multifaceted picture. What was the result of your wide-ranging study, sort of research enterprise? And do you find echoes in certain depictions of this region which would resemble those which Dr. Richard Herzinger has just described?
We will stay here till December. First of all, the interest in Russia, Russian people, different societies was increasing in the first decade of the 21st century. And then it stabilized on a certain level. So I cannot see any development or new thoughts in this area. The most interesting, important conclusions from this multi-textual search for the truth about Russia is there is no truth, one truth about Russia. Because the closer we are to the one sentence, for instance, Russia is East, East is barbarian anti-culture, barbarian anti-culture should be dismissed, destroyed, changed into the cultural and civilized West, for instance, is of course stupid, simply saying. Second, maybe the most valuable fruit of this multi-textual voyage through Russia was a change of, deep change of language, that is self-reflection over the language and the set of categories used to depict, describe, and characterize Russia. Maybe the deepest work was done by Mariusz Wilk, who has written several books inventing almost new language, a mixture of Polish and Russian language. Of course, it cannot lead, such language cannot lead us to distinct, clear solutions, some kind of resume ready for politicians to make decisions, but it's very important for the readers to start self-reflection on our languages, standpoints, categories we are using. So I cannot see new books, new narratives about Russia, which is maybe equally valuable as a kind of restraint or moment of reflection and silence before the narratives could be restarted. Yes, but if you allow me, I would like to say that according to your characterization, the West is clear and the East maybe less clear, but also distinct. I'd like to say that, of course, liberal democracy is a very important language to characterize the history of Central or Central Eastern Europe after 1989. That is, of course, a matter of course. But if we look at it thoroughly, we can see that after 1989, the democracy in Poland, in Hungary, in the Czech Republic was, so to say, more liberal than democratic, that it was a kind of liberal anti-democracy, because democracy means possibility of participation in the controlling of politicians, of power. So we can participate in the political life, we can choose, we can elect our representatives, and then we can control them. While liberalism means that the internal policy is based on human and citizen rights. So, after 1989, our states, Poland, for instance, was, which we can take as something obvious, was liberal, but not, or less and less democratic, because the possibility of participation and controlling the power was weakening, was being weakened. After 2015, the situation is quite reverse. So we have democracy, so to say, weakening or weakened democracy, but anti-liberal one, yes? So once more, the difference between East and West is blurred because of this gray and rather great zone where human rights, social rights are manageable and under manipulation, yes? So once more, I cannot see new narratives about Russia, which is probably caused by this domination of politics of power maintained by Putin's and his governments, which is the new period of this dichotomy, East-West dichotomy. But it seems to me that Polish culture is well prepared to new period that is to set anew, to redefine this dichotomy and the political background on the Russian society because of all those different narratives pointing at, describing of Russian society more than Russian powers. Because when we look at the highest level of the state, that is the government, the parliament, things are getting dull, too much obvious. One cannot say much about a state when one governor is governing all. But things are getting different and more difficult to solve, to describe, to define when we are looking at the society. 150 million of people, more than 30 languages and cultures. This is Russia, yes? So maybe now things are harsh and hard, harmful, because there is a war. But what future will arise from this war? That is maybe the question, yeah?
Actually like to move on with a question to Justyna Gotkowska, but I could sense, I think, some either head nodding or it was a different reaction by Dr. Herzinger. Would you like to make a short comment meanwhile?
I don't know if I got it all right, and I don't know if I really can get along. The problem is you're talking about a Russian society. There is no Russian society anymore. That's the problem. That's the big change. You're talking about Russia as a country of so many cultures and languages, but this is bound to break up sooner or later, because the Russian government, so-called government, is not a government. It is a criminal gang, and the Russian state has become identical with this aggressive gang, which is trying not only to wipe out Ukraine from the map, but trying to declare war on the whole Western world. And I can see no outcome at all except Russia to be crushed, the Russian power to be crushed militarily and politically, so that they will be reduced to something like Germany after 1945. So talking about Russian culture and Russian, it doesn't really make sense at this point. That's a real tragedy. It's a real, a terrible danger. It's awful to having to speak like this. But I think there will be no Russia anymore, because Russia, in the shape that it is now, because it was conquered by a criminal organization that merged mafia with secret services and so on, and they are trying to wage war on the whole civilized world. So there will be either a 1945, a total breakdown of Russia, because there is nothing, you cannot see anywhere anything, a society. What's left of the Russian society has fled the country. And there's no political force whatsoever that could change the course of this country anymore. So there will be either a 1945 or there will be the destruction of West of Europe and the West in general. I totally agree that this is again an example that is not an East-West problem. Will the pro-Putin, will the pro-destruction, will the pro-criminal, the pro-fascist forces who collaborate with Putin, will they succeed in the West? Then it's over. Or will Russia be defeated? And there's no, I can see a third way, and this, and let me add this, the West is so, the Western Europeans are so proud of their history and civilization and so on. But the real West is Ukraine now. It's Ukraine. Everything will be decided in Ukraine. If Ukraine will be extinguished by the Russian this criminal force, some call it fascist, then there will be no West anymore, sooner or later. Yeah, just to put this in a more dramatic note in this whole discussion.
Dr. Herziger, you have sort of run into the future points of this discussion, because that was the last point that I wanted to ask you, what has changed since February 2022. That's live. So, Justyna Goskova, I hope you don't mind me if I just take one step back. I wanted to come back to the discourse of the West and international within foreign policy circles and pundits in Poland. Because I can't obviously speak for our audience, but if I were to imagine a daily reader of Western newspapers, and someone who has a particular interest in the region, has been to Poland numerous times, I think his, her, or their opinion would be that the way you described it, there's a nationwide consensus what the West is. We all wanted to access NATO and the EU, and we have done so with immense success. That this is a success story which certainly holds true for the 90s. It also holds true in terms of military actions since February 2022 and NATO's potential plans to make out of Poland a military hub. But what about the period in between? There still are conflicts of opinion and perceptions within Poland and the EU. There was also quite a heated debate in Poland about geopolitics and whether we should rely mostly on the transatlantic alliance or whether Poland should primarily build its own strength. So this person might ask you that the story that you've told is too good to be true. Is it?
Yes, thank you for this question with many points and many topics mentioned, and I will try to structure them a bit in order to show the discussion and perception in Poland from my perspective. And I think, of course, we were Polish elites, Polish society, Polish expert circles were united in the 90s, and as we described, to rejoin the West with success. And then we had a period of relatively uncontroversial growth, economic growth, and political stability. NATO moved from collective defense to crisis management. Polish center of gravity of the security policy moved along. Poland started to take part in US and NATO crisis management operations. But then with 2008, Russia-Georgian war, then 2014, first Russian annexation of Crimea, first Russian intervention in Donbass, and in the years afterwards, the discourse about the West and security and defense policies started to change, but also the discourse in Poland about the West in terms of economic policy started to change, and much more questions have been raised whether this West serves and suits Polish interests best. Because first of all, people started to understand that the policy pursued by the major Western players, especially in Europe, France and Germany, may not be beneficial to Poland. And I think that we see the consequences of this failed policies on part of France and Germany right now, with the war in Ukraine, on failed Russia policy, failed Ukraine policy, failed energy policy, failed security policy in Western European states. Poland has seen that coming, and Poland has questioned the course of our allies in these crucial policies that were so important to, existential interests of Poland as a state, of Polish sovereignty, to maintain Polish sovereignty, territorial integrity. So in security and defense terms, a discussion began about whether this West is organized within NATO, whether main actors of NATO really pursue policies that are beneficial to Poland, and or whether they pursue policies that counteract Polish interests. And then we started to have in a Polish debate experts, or maybe people, these persons discussing controversial notions of Poland, of enhancing Polish position within existing structures or maybe beyond them, in order to make Poland's Polish interests in security and defense policy, but also in economic policy, more that they come to the fore. But I think that the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the relative unity of the West have partly ended these discussions. That the reaction by the US, the reaction of the EU in terms of sanctions, a unified position of the EU and the US in many questions, relatively, has shown that only a united West can make a difference, can defeat Russia if it wants to. And it's the Western unity is not displayed right now, and resolve is not displayed right now to the full. The West united can do more, but I think there are fears of managing the situation, of escalating the war, and hence there is some restraint of the West, Western support to Ukraine, of Western containment of Russia. But still, even with this reaction, the Russia is losing its ground. And I strongly believe that Russia at the end will lose this war, and we will have 1945 moment, but the question is in which direction then Russia will move, whether that will be a collapse of the Russian state, or whether there will be with unknown consequences, or whether we will decide upon short and mid-term isolation of Russia in order to so that will change Russia and make it less aggressive, less dangerous for us in the years to come.
Thank you very much. We are slowly approaching the final round before we give the floor to you, dear audience, with our Q&A round, which is bound to follow. Before that, Professor Czaplinski, though our studio lights are likely to not move a bit, I would like to shift the topical limelight of our discussion for a second. In your writings, and also in some of your shorter pieces, you have also shed some light on not only the East and West dominating our imagined geographies, to use this term again, but also the notions of South and North. on a whole wide array of different aspects, including, for instance, the popularity of Swedish literature in the early 2000s, which many of us might still remember quite well. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, a thinker, author from a different political spectrum, so to speak, Professor Marek Cichocki, has also published a book where he not only makes the case that North and South are have gained recently momentum, but in order to understand Polish history, we ought to introduce those terms. Could you describe from your point of view, what is the South and North axis? What is its role in the public Polish discourse, and what is its relationship with East and West?
Till January. Well, we are talking about cultural and geographic imagination. And we are talking about imagination because the imagination has gained incredible power, or is gaining incredible power all over the world, not only in Central Europe or in Europe. The imagination, similarly to effects, is getting the position of a casual factor, an agent of policy and politics, of history, because people are acting according to imagination, that is according to narratives, pictures, phantasms, and so on and so on. It seems to me that since the 90s, it could be observed very interesting process in Polish culture, process of shifting the axis of interest from horizontal to vertical. That is from east-west axis to the axis, to the north-south axis. It was first connected with weakening of the importance of the West. We are talking about the social imagination, so not about real structures of a state and the whole process of coping the Western modernization. So first, it was connected with weakening of the West as a goal of social development, especially North was a perfect solution of our problems because it gave us the imagination of equality, social and legal equality in the state and among the classes or the people creating the society. Second, stabilization of development, of course, equal rights for gender, so in gender politics, and equal rights for immigrants, for instance. And additionally, the narratives describing or imagining the North gave us the picture of modernity which is never-ending story that is that always could be renewed or redefined or changed, which is based on the social trust to the government, which means that a society trusts their government, but also gives the government to commit errors, faults. Yes, it is human. Everyone could make a mistake, but for the Polish modernity, tracking the northern model of modernity, equally important was the way of managing the social and political mistakes, how to repair them, how to change, how to diagnose them and restore the order. So, and the fourth point of this new axis, when we are observing the North from the position of Poland, we are less interested in Western respect, which is a minority complex, very important for small or medium-sized countries. So when we shift the axis, we are no longer so much interested in respect from Germany and France, because we are among smaller or medium-sized countries such as Norway, Sweden, or Denmark. Yes, this is our size, and this is the proportion in which we should put ourselves in. So, different model of modernization concentrated on equality, human rights, gender equality, very important for Polish culture, and not so much on economic development, on gross domestic product as a main, as a base for definition of development of state. Yes, so all these points were creating a kind of alternative for Polish culture. Let us imagine, said the literature, let us imagine that the Western societies and the Western countries and the whole West is not so important for us as the northern parts of Europe. So after that, new start, we can create our history within different frame, more concentrated on society than on a state, more on equality and social trust than on internal relations between Polish state and other states. We are more interested in well-being of the society than of the proud of the state on the international affair. Yeah.
Thank you. Justyna Gutkowska, I would also like to ask you about the North in terms of security and defense analysis, since I also know that you've been conducting analysis of Sweden and Scandinavian countries in general. And Professor Czapliński has just, I hope this depiction is correct, but shown the south-northern axis definitely to enrich our geographical public imagination. Does the North enrich our international politics perspective as well?
Thank you. I'm also a Swedish speaker, and I started in Sweden, so the North is close to my heart. But I think we have different discourses about the North in Poland. We have a discourse on the on social issues, and in this area I would agree with Professor Czapliński. But I would not like to compare Poland to Sweden, Denmark, Finland, or Norway. These are small countries, countries that have 5 million up to 10 million in case of Sweden, the biggest country in the north. They perceive themselves as small countries, and I think they perceive also Poland as a regional power. Increasingly as a regional power, a much bigger country than they are, a country that is important from security and defense perspective, that invests a lot in security and defense, that conducts a very active foreign and security policy, that is a player within the EU and within NATO, that is on par with well, maybe not on par, but has relations within with Germany and France that these countries do not have, and it's a bit different league, political league, than the Nordic countries. The Nordic countries perceive themselves as a bloc, and then in various policy areas, not in all. And through being a bloc, they within the EU and in future within NATO, they want to acquire more impact and more influence on certain policies. North-South divide, I see it differently. Again, depending on policy areas, I see this discourse in economic policy within the EU, north-south divide, and here Poland, depending on the topic, is closer to the northern camp, but not in all areas. I think that the Nordics prefer to curb the EU expenditure and support for member states in specific policies, and I think it's not the Polish stance. But in security and defense, I think the North is joining us, actually. The North is joining the eastern flank, not the East, because I don't want to, these are different categories. But with Sweden, Finland joining NATO, Sweden and Finland will be joining the eastern flank, and will have the northeastern flank within NATO of countries that border Russia. They are investing heavily in their security and defense, that are very wary of Russian provocation and Russian actions against them. The best example, the explosions of Nord Stream 1 and 2 in Danish and Swedish exclusive economic zone, which showed to these countries that Russia is a hybrid threat to them, and is increasingly a hybrid threat to them with Russian drones and Russian subversive activities towards the energy infrastructure, for example, and not only on Nord Stream 1 and 2, but on the oil and gas installation and in the Nordic Sea, in case of Norway, and also in case of Denmark. Sweden, Finland joining NATO, joining the eastern flank, will enhance our security. Not only because these countries invest in their defenses, have a similar perspective of Russia, but we will have one space, or the Baltic Sea will become a NATO lake. We'll have one theater of operations. We will integrate our defenses, and hence this will be to great benefit to us. So this is a reverse situation than we had a few years ago, because back then there were many claims in Poland, discussions about Poland joining the NORDEFCO, the Nordic Security and Defense Cooperation. And now it's the other way around. These countries are joining us because it's NATO as a Western institution that is the only guarantor of security and defense vis-à-vis Russia. Regional groupings are not are too weak to suit that goal.
Dr. Herzinger, I would like to direct the last question before we open the floor to our audience, which will hopefully provide us with thought-provoking questions, and move back for a second to East and West. I hope that is fine with you. Because what you described, I think, also very much reflects some of the analysis or ideas from a historian named Gerd Könen and the so-called German-Russian complex, which according to him ended in 1951. Now my question to you would be, you mentioned it before, and you've actually in the past reviewed the two books, The Long Road West, Heinrich August Winkler, the aforementioned one, and also Edgar Wolfrum, Der Aufsteiger. So he sort of portrayed Germany as a country which was sort of promoted to Premier League internationally. Your diagnosis, your synopsis, especially since February 2022, Long Road West in Germany, has it ended in success?
Let me first add something to your arguments, because I totally agree with you. I would even go a step further. That's an amazing historical chance for Poland now to really become a leading power in the whole of Europe, because the whole constellation has now changed. Poland, let's not forget about the Baltic states, they predicted what would happen. And this brings, while the West, Germany and France, have, as you pointed out, totally failed with their their attitude towards Russia. So this will have consequences for the distribution of influence and power in the whole of Europe. And I always saw it as for years, I saw it as a kind of sad thing that Poland, or the actual government of Poland, Poland having such enormous potentiality, economic, but also in terms of traditions of liberty, of freedom, and so on, and that they did not use these potentialities, but fled into some kind of victim role, saying we are encircled by they want bad to us, they want to do us bad things, and so as they were used from the history. You know, Poland was always victim in history, and now it for the first time it becomes the chance to play a leading role for the whole of Europe, and this should happen now. They should feel responsible for the future of Europe. They should try to really create the features of the future Europe, and I think there will be very interesting debates coming. Unfortunately, this debate is not yet has not yet reached Germany at all. That all this will have dramatic consequences for the whole shape of the future of the whole European Union. But in one way or another, it will happen. One more remark. I agree with you, but I'm not sure if I'm as optimistic, because the West. The question is how long and how will this unity of the West hold, you know? And that's a very, very big danger that it will not hold, that it will more or less crumble, and Putin is speculating on this. This is his only perspective to still win this war, is that the West will not hold. And unfortunately, it's not only Eastern Europe. Again, it's not an Eastern-West problem. You see Italy, you see France. There's a great danger of the West splitting up or not holding against for a long time to come. It might take a long time until the war is decided. So very short. I hope I remember the question now. Has Germany succeeded its way to the West? As Heinrich August Winkler, a long way to the West? Yes, it did, but has the way ended? Or does the way go on and maybe wind up to a quite a different direction? And also in any way, on any way, you can turn and go back. And you mentioned the historian Wolfram. Germany is the winner. Germany is this is a sound of, let's say, 2010 or something, or even after Trump came to power, even more. Germany is now holding the torch of the West and is the leading power of the West, and so on. All this, in my opinion, has been destroyed and totally destructed since February 24, at least. Now it's really a problem how strong really the values of the West are really implemented in the German society. This is the acid test now, because as you all know, Germany has this wonderful democracy that we have and still have, and I don't mean it ironically, it's a wonderful democracy, but it was originally given to us. It was not our own achievement, you know, and the whole identity of this German post-war democracy of the Bundesrepublik was prosperity. This was the main value, prosperity and stability. These were main values on which the Bundesrepublik rested and still rests, and both, and not so much the idea of freedom and liberty. Even in 1989, 1990, there are really two narratives in Europe, East and West. For Germany, the key values are unity, peace, and stability. This all was reached in 89, 90 by the great Helmut Kohl and this wonderful Gorby, who gave us this all this. You know, they don't talk about the Americans. It would not have happened without the Americans, but they are grateful to Gorby, which was, by the way, then the fundament for this appeasement politics towards Putin, believing that the Russians are good people. If you talk to them as long enough, they will be nice to you. So there is a real let's say this whole world picture in Germany now is really shaken, and it will be shaken much more. And if you see the reactions of a part of this country, people on the streets, you know, protesting against the government and protesting against support for Ukraine and so on, it is really an acid test now. How strong these Western values are really implemented in the German society, and it could be also be the necessary thing that really leads to this to this implementation of these values. Let's see, but I'm afraid it's an open question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we started with questions and we ending with questions, which is often the case. And now we are awaiting your questions. Who would like to ask the first one?
Good evening. Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. My name is Caroline Giel from the Institute for Foreign Cultural Relations. I have 3 questions to Dr. Herzinger. The first one, how you would define the idea of the East after February 22? Because you spoke about the idea of the West. So in your words, what's the idea nowadays of the East? Then the second question to you is why the Westerners lost the power in Russia? Why the idea of the West did not win in Russia? And the last question to you, Justyna Gotkowska, who will finance the Marshall Plan for Russia? Thank you.
That's a very good question, but very huge question. Has the perspective towards the East, or the perception of the East, changed in Germany since February 24? I guess so, but it's not quite clear which consequences this will have. The so-called Eastern Europe was more or less ignored in the German perception, even after 89, 90. It was seen as the countries in between. They are part of, they are our partners, they are our friends, and so on, but they are not really to be taken seriously. They have to learn. They have to learn to be like us. That was basically the attitude. And when they warned of Russia and Putin's imperialism and the danger of that, people in Germany said, well, we understand these fears, we understand, but they are a bit exaggerating, playing this up, you know, because they don't understand. They are not long enough in the business of world politics to understand that. That was the basic attitude, not to take the Eastern Europe countries seriously. Ukraine was probably not present at all in the perception of Germany. We have this famous what Helmut Schmidt, the former chancellor, said, well, Ukraine, that is not even a nation. It is a part, it's an artificial construction. It has a West that is pro-Western, and the whole East is pro-Russian, and it's not a nation. So this was a very, very widespread position in the German public. Now they cannot say this anymore. It is not that they don't want to say it, but they cannot, because obviously they were totally wrong. And obviously Ukraine does not only exist, Ukraine is the most important country in the world now. And it is not only showing the arrogant Westerners, not only that they were right with their warnings, they were not exaggerating, they are showing, now you have the discussion, may Ukraine come into NATO, and when should this happen? Well, the NATO should back Ukraine on its knees to come to NATO as soon as possible, because Ukraine is showing the West how to win wars. Yeah, how to win war against allegedly undefeatable enemy. When did the West win a war? When was this the last time that the West won a war? You know, so this cannot be denied anymore. Also, I talked about Poland, and not to forget the Baltic states, who were obviously right. What they told them for years was obviously right. Putin will use Nord Stream as a means of blackmail. Everybody said, "Oh, this cannot be. Come on." Now it's reality, so you cannot deny it anymore, and you have to look in a different way on the so-called East. But as I said before, what consequences this will have, this is open, and the discussion really has not seriously begun here about this. What was the second question? Oh, the loose. Well, that's a really tough question, because maybe there was a chance for a short time after 1991 for Russia to really become a real nation, a real state, a real part of the civilized world. But they should have, they would have had to define what their idea of their nation is, what they are here for in this world. Russia has never developed such an idea. It was always an empire. This was never a national state. It was an empire based on the oppression, and violence. Violence, violence, violence. And violence was the only answer to this shock or this breakdown of the Soviet Union. What will Russia be? Russia will be a power that is feared by the others. That is the only idea that they developed. And they failed to reform their country. The whole economy was taken over by the party cliques and the mafia, by criminals. So there was a misunderstanding or a total wrong idea of what the West is, you know. I remember somebody saying, I don't know who it was, he said, Putin first was pro-Western because he misunderstood the West. He thought in the West you can you know, make big money and nobody asks you how and so on. When he found out that this is not quite the reality in the West, he started hating the West. So it was a misunderstanding of what Western, tradition of Western values means. It's the whole country became a victim of robbery, you know, and but they blamed it then on the West. They blamed the Western values for this. This made the career of Putin. To make it short, I think we talked about this. Russia really seriously, in one way or another, has to start to find out what their state, what the idea of a state, what the definition of their nation should be, except violence, hatred, and extermination of whatever stands in their way. If this doesn't happen, they will have no future at all, whether be with or a part of the West.
I will try to add something to that, the idea of the East after 2022. I hope Russia to become a pariah state in the years to come, and the discourse about the West and the East shifting totally. And the new East is China is becoming the new East for the current West. So I think we might. I think the global new terms are emerging, like global South. So I will stick to the New East. Who will finance the Marshall Plan? You mentioned for Russia, but the understanding is for Ukraine. For Russia, I understood this question that it's Ukraine that we need to rebuild and that we need to.
No, because I heard the year 45, right? And
okay.
And what was the situation in 45? I mean, Germany was completely destroyed, and so I think then, if you play this scenario, you cannot leave like a country like destroyed for ages. So what's the so you stopped by saying, okay, the defeat of Russia, yeah. But what comes next?
I think that I'm not sure whether this is the analogy, because after the Second World War, the Marshall Plan was being devised for the Western Germany, a part of the West.
Marshall Plan and Nuremberg also.
I think we are not that far yet to think about reconstruction of Russia after its total defeat. There will not be a military solution or a military defeat of Russia, and as it was in case of Germany. Simply the West, NATO will not go into a full-out war with Russia on Russian territory, at least if Russia will not attack NATO. So I think we are very far from this thinking right now, because we are in a very unpredictable, unstable situation, and to predict the course of the next months is difficult. To predict what will happen, in which direction Russia will go, whether that will be strengthening of Putin's regime, or whether there will be a breakup of Putin's regime, what will come next, whether there will be a kind of nationalistic regime in Russia, whether there will be a breakup of Russian chaos, it's difficult to judge. So I think we are not that far now to think about Marshall Plan for Russia, but it is an interesting idea, and for me, for the future, to think about it.
Well, I haven't been asked, but I would like to answer. Maybe the analogy should be different, not 1945, but 1918. First, it is the empire which is fading and fading. So the end of empire, shaky, unstable, but empire, because dangerous, because with nuclear weapon. So the destruction of the empire, it is the first analogy connecting us with 1918, not with 1945. Second, there will be no Nuremberg for Russia. I don't believe in that. There are no international power or court, international court enough strong to execute the justice in Russia. And third, the defeat of Russia will leave the Russian politicians in resentment, just like the German politicians after 1918. And the resentment was a huge factor in the political history of 20th century.
So I would follow this notion of empire, maybe, so with my question, because I think that there is possible, so because this East-West divide is embedded in our remembrance on this, from the period of the Cold War, and we used to structure our imaginary world into these two categories of East and West. And after 1989, so there was the normal or quite visible trend, as was described by you, among the countries of our region, to go from the east to the west, and this vision of Poland, for example, being part of Europe, of Poland being part of the West. And now, maybe, just maybe, so we are in a situation that this notion of empire is more useful to describe the possible future. So in this way, that if we think about the Roman Empire, for example, the notion of limes, so then, and if we think about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, about the Habsburg Empire, so also with such a patchwork structure and not clear limes, so this border. And if we have the situation that Russia is possible or could be possible destroyed or there could be the breakup of Russia, and we have the situation that some regions or some countries or some populations want to be the part on this right side of the limes, and the Western world, this free world, is something like a Roman Empire, so in a new structure. And we have also maybe possible also this other empire somewhere in the world, not as the East, and not, but China as a other point of so there's such a magnetic point of strength of being strong enough in this other part of the world. We can think about the world as such a more nuanced play of two empires. So with shifting boundaries, with shifting limes, so and regions like us, for example, now in Ukraine. So it was the normal situation that at the border of empire, so at the border of Roman empires, at the limes, there was one thing, that there was the trend to build some marks, some markia. So there's some borders which were fortified. This is this eastern flank mentioned by Justina, and also some populations, some regions wanting to be part of this empire of limes and making different agreements with the. So with the Rome, yes, and okay, so we want to be part of it, and we want to change this flank, this limes, somewhere further east or something. And we can have such a situation that in the future world we have the period of chaos in the territories of nowadays Russia. So because the Russia could be so not the one state, and maybe some chaotic world in between in Afghanistan and other people, and we have also the other empire around China. So I don't know. So this is just a question for you to maybe this notion of empire is not defining by East and West, but just the some sort of the new form of empire. So it's something which we can use for this imaginary world for future. And this is also the second remark, and because most of your analysis, so probably of all participants of the panel, were in a way such a elitist. I mean that in the sense that all the mentioned documents we think about in such an analysis are literature, so the Thomas Mann, Nietzsche, and other. So this politicians, or maybe also and this is also the question about the perceptions in populations. I mean, that what about populations? What normal people think about East and West, and what people, so to say, so in Russia or in Ukraine, you said that Richard, that there's no Russian society as such now, but maybe this is also the question: what think the people, what think the populations, what think rank and file members of the societies?
More a 1918 situation than a 1945 situation, but in a way we already had the 1918 situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then this resentment, like in Germany after the Versailles Treaty, these resentment politicians came up and started the whole game all over again, even more destructive than ever before. And this is what happened with the rise of Putin. Now it's in parallel to 1945, we have to take care that this is not happening again. And I agree that it will not be, Russia cannot be defeated militarily like Germany was in 1945, but at least there could be such a horrible defeat for them in Ukraine and elsewhere. By the way, why don't we forget about Syria? You know, we should get active there in other parts of the whatever that they cannot that they cannot attack other countries again by this defeat and by ruining them with economic means. At least this should happen so that we, as much as the West did not repeat the era of 1918 with Germany, should not the era of 1918 should not repeat it by leaving forces in power that would do it all over again.
I do agree. Russia, a Western military defeat of Russia may come only if Russia attacks the West, and we need to use the economic means from our side, and then arm Ukraine to the best as much as we can in order for them to defeat Russia, which will be. Which will have a huge impact on the Russian mind, or on the Russian thinking about them as a neo-imperial power, in which thinking Ukraine was the jewel in the crown and an element that was needed to reconstruct the empire. But with the unknown futures of where Russia will end up after the end of this war, we need to prepare for many scenarios, and we need to fortify the limits. And we need to take care of our own defenses on the eastern flank, with the northern flank now joining, Sweden, Finland, Norway ramping up their defenses also in the Arctic. And I hope that Ukraine joining NATO and joining the West in strengthening the Western defenses vis-a-vis the unknown solution or unknown futures of Russia. I don't like the word empire, and I don't like the comparison to the Roman Empire, because I hope Europe or the West will not end as it is. We need to prepare for a different world that is coming. For the West need to stay united and stay and enhance its political unity, economic unity, policies, coordinated policies vis-à-vis the next challenge that is coming, and this is China. And I think this is the biggest challenge for us, how to prepare for a world in which China will be rising, even politically, economically, and militarily above what we are seeing now. And we need to prepare for a world with unpredictable Russia, because we are not, we have little influence beyond economic sanctions, beyond arming Ukraine, on in which direction the domestic situation in Russia will develop.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think it's getting late, to put it mildly. Thank you so much for staying all the time with us. A quick final announcement for all Exercising Modernity participants. This will be no news, but we've actually started now what we call a marathon of open events. So tomorrow there's also a very promising artist talk. On Saturday there is another discussion, this time about the totalitarian legacy and various modes of adapting within various cultures of remembrance, with a lineup as impressive as ours today. And next week there's also an event about architecture by an scholarship holder from Exercising Modernity. You find all the necessary details, information on our webpage, social media profiles, and so on. And I would like to thank all our panelists for at times passionate debate, and you, dear audience, and have a nice evening. I hope this was an enriching and enlightening evening. Thank you very much.